Welcome to my channel where we cover the lore of video games. We cover all kinds from the mainstream to the indie, so I hope you enjoy your stay, and welcome to the Chronicler of Lore. Just like that then, another squadron, lost. Conrad's shoulders sagged as he sighed and muttered under his breath, cursing the gods or himself. Monago watched his eyes. They looked past her, past everything. What do you see? The faces of the poor bastards you ordered to East End, I'll bet. Some of our best. None had survived the ambush. The Alamegan resistance comprised countless factions, and the people of Raga's Reach were but one. By its nature, it could never truly be defeated by the Imperial Army. Nevertheless, the loss of so many experienced soldiers, some of whom had fought for nearly 20 years, would be keenly felt. Even a bloody novice like me can see that. Monago cleared her throat. We don't know if the Imperials found the tunnel, sir, but even if they didn't, without our men to guide them, our friends from Ul'dah are likely stranded. Out of the corner of her eye, Monago spied Mefrit frowning. Well, if you're not going to say it. Sir, if I may. Who are these people, and why are we risking so much to get them on the wrong side of Belsar's bloody wall? The obvious question was answered with folded arms and furtive glances. After a time, Conrad spoke. They're scions of the Seventh Dawn, old friends. One is the daughter of Curtis Hex. The voice of the rebellion? The man who spat in the Mad King's eye? Monago wasn't sure what answer she had expected, but this wasn't it. Bloody novice indeed. Name's Ida, Conrad continued. After the occupation, she fled to Sharlayan, learned a lot there, I'm told, but she never forgot about us. Ida's been assisting us for years now, as a scion. Monago had heard about the scions, the saviors of Eorzea some had called them, but they had become embroiled in the political machinations of Ul'dah's elite, and now people were saying that they had assassinated the Sultana. It seemed that Ida and her companion had reached out to the resistance seeking a means to escape justice. The East End squadron was their last hope, or so Monago thought. Nothing for it but to go and get them ourselves, Conrad said. The leaves twisted and twirled as they tumbled to the ground, traced by two pairs of eyes in the brush. All this for two people? It's not like him. Monago knelt, an arrow notched in her bow, trying desperately to ignore her own heartbeat. Gods, I hate waiting. Trust in the old bear. He wouldn't take the risk if it wasn't worth it. Mefrit, who had been tasked with training Monago, was ever the voice of reason. He had told her before how the Scions were instrumental in the Eorzean Alliance's campaign against the 14th Legion, of how their forces had led an assault on Castra Meridianum during the Operation Archon, in which Gaius Van Belsar was killed. Such powerful allies would be invaluable in enlisting the support of the Alliance, without whom they could not hope to liberate Alamigo. Monago scowled. If you say so. Mefrit glanced at her sidelong, then sighed. Just between us, I reckon he's got a mind to recruit her. Maybe even groom her for a leading role. Who? Ida? Think about it. The daughter of a revolutionary hero, returned to fight for her homeland's freedom. Now that's a tale that'll move men's hearts. That's a banner people will flock to. A bard's tale, aye. Some girl who's been away for 20 years. Just what we need. Symbols have power, he continued. Heard of the Griffin? She nodded. Mad bastard and his mask are preaching bloody vengeance to all and sundry. None knew his true identity, though some claimed he was a distant relative of Theodoric. Some even thought that was a good thing. Anyone's better than the Garleans, eh? Sod that, we've had enough of kings. A hawk's cry rang out. Time to go, lass. Up, up. The pair broke cover and ran towards the rocks. The entrance was well concealed and showed no signs of recent use. A short while later, as they crawled on their hands and knees through a narrow tunnel dug more than a decade before, Monago recalled stories of Imperial sabotage and bodies buried beneath a mountain of earth and stone. She thought of Conrad and the others. Fighting right now. Dying right now, maybe. You'd better be worth it. The pair were in a bad way when they finally limped into the Reach, and what a pair they were. Bleeding and bickering, still fuming over some great betrayal back in Ul'dah, worried sick about their comrades from whom they had been separated in the chaos. But a week at the barber's did wonders for their disposition. To a point. Papalimo, the thaumaturge, invariably assumed he was the cleverest person in the room, an attitude made all the more annoying by the fact that he invariably was. Ida, on the other hand, was reckless and impulsive, emotional, but she had a way with people, a way of making them smile and think everything was going to be all right. Both the scions were eager to lend a hand and repay the resistance, and it was not long before Manago came to view them as friends and comrades in arms. But when she thought back to what Mefford had said about Conrad's designs, about grooming Ida as a leader, she just couldn't see it. Not yet. It was a day like any other. Manago and Ida had been tasked with reconnoitering Castrum Oriens and were preparing to return home when a high-pitched wail cut through the silence. "A woman," hissed the scout, suddenly alert. "No, a girl." The villages in East End had long been abandoned, and only Imperial soldiers traveled the roads. No one in their right mind ought to be out here. "Let's go, Manago." Ida was already running. "Gods damn it." Manago tried to keep up, then settled for trying to keep her companion in sight. After running what felt like moms, they arrived at the foot of a great tree. Lying at its roots was an older man, unconscious, bleeding from countless wounds. He was wearing resistance colors. Before him, a little girl stood sobbing. "Followed the trail of blood, did you?" Realization dawned. "Seven hells, I think he's one of the survivors we dispatched to meet you a month back. I thought there were no survivors." Ida knelt beside the man and began tending his wounds. "There'll be plenty of time for questions later," she said without turning. "Take the girl and head back to the Reach." Manago blinked. "Eh?" "Papalimo told me about this tactic. He's bait. The Imperials probably heard the girl too. They'll be here any moment." "Then we've got to get out of here. Both of us. That or we both stay and fight. The girl's not part of this. Someone has to take her, and this man's one of ours. We can't just leave him here." Manago glared at Ida. 3 fighters, one at death's door, and a crying little girl, all in the shadow of a bloody castrum. Gods damn it. Manago grabbed the girl by the arm and tried to drag her away. She simply stood there, frozen. Gods damn it all. Manago scooped the child up and flung her over her shoulder. "Stay alive. I'll be back." And then she ran. Manago wound her way north through the forest, her mind racing. Get the girl to safety. Call for reinforcements. Movement. She ducked behind a tree and strained to listen. "She can't have gone far," shouted a voice. Woman, distraught, Alamegan, mother. Thank the 12. The woman wore hunter's leathers and had a bow slung across her back. She stared when she first saw Manago, but ran towards her when she recognized the girl cradled in her arms. She tried to thank her as she took the girl from Manago, but the scout had already turned and started running back the way she had come. You'd better still be alive. Bodies lay strewn about the clearing, men and women clad in steel and black cloth. A whole patrol. They were all dead. Carefully, she stepped over in between them, eyes fixed on the sole figure that still stood, streaked with mud and blood and panting like a feral beast. It whirled at her approach, fists raised, teeth bared, growling low. By Roger. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. Then Ida let her arms fall to her sides and sank to her knees, her face a picture of dismay. Papalimo's never gonna let me hear the end of this. And indeed, the thaumaturge would chastise Ida when they returned to Roger's Reach, nor could she blame him. It was stupid and reckless and impossible to justify. And yet... Days later, after Ida had time to recover, Manago found her one night standing at Starfall Shore and staring up at the destroyer. She asked the scion then and there if she would consider joining the resistance, but Ida refused. Funnily enough, you're not even the first person to ask. I said no to Conrad too. But why? This is your homeland. This is your fight. I mean, for God's sake, you're the daughter of Curtis Hext. People will follow you, don't you see? Ida bowed her head, then looked again to the towering statue of Roger. I'm his daughter, not him. I may not know a lot of things, but I know that's not enough. Manago opened her mouth to protest but couldn't find the words. Papalimo and I have still got friends out there. Good people we fought beside time and again. After we find them, we'll work together to make it right. She turned to her and smiled. That's all that matters in the end, isn't it, Nago? At first she wasn't sure how to respond, but Manago found herself smiling back. What does it matter what we call each other, she thought, both then and later when Lise told her the truth about her sister and the mask and everything else. You're still the same woman, the same friend. I'll fight with you, and I'll follow you too. Ishtola closed her eyes, savoring the flavor and the warmth of the tea. It had not been long since the great battle for Alamigo's liberation, but in this moment of blessed respite, it might as well have been an age. The patisserie's unassuming tables and chairs were arranged along one of Limsa Lamensa's coiling decks, offering patrons a fine view of the Rotano. Eschewing the pomp and ceremony of Limsa's more lauded establishments, it was favored among locals as a place for friends to spend a relaxing afternoon by the sea. To look at her casually sipping tea, contentment writ upon her face, none would have guessed the trials Istola had recently overcome. As she replaced her cup, a soft chuckle escaped her lips. Spread out before her were an assortment of mouth-watering treats, among them the patisserie's specialty, a rich vanilla tart laden with glistening jam and plump berries. Across the table, Alice raised a quizzical eyebrow as she popped another cookie into her mouth. Dusting off her fingers, she scanned the area for the invitees who had yet to arrive. Her eyes settled upon a familiar figure bounding towards them. "Sorry I'm late," Lise exclaimed, breathless. Istola waved away the apology. "Yours was the longer journey, and we started without you." With a happy sigh, Lise flopped into a chair. She was once more dressed in the clothing she had worn during her sojourn into the Far East. This was their first meeting since she had announced her decision to remain in Garabania to aid in rebuilding her homeland, and it was as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. After placing her order with the attending waitress, she turned to regard her friends fondly. "Gods, it's good to see you." After a short pause, she continued, "Is this all of us?" "Crow regrettably cannot attend," Istola explained. "She is in the midst of an important survey and said that she would content herself with a delivery. As for the Warrior of Light..." Swallowing her cookie, Alice picked up where Istola had trailed off, a hint of displeasure in her voice. "Oh, he's doubtless engaged in some heroic endeavor or other. He knows the time and place, though, and gave me no reason to believe he wouldn't come." Lisa's smile was half amused, half resignation. "The more things change, eh? He never could stay still for long." Taking this as an invitation, Alice gave vent to her frustration. "Isn't that the truth? If he's not cheating death with his fellow adventurers, you can be sure he's off helping the beast tribes, or collecting tombstones, or regaling the children of Idleshire with the tales of his exploits, or delivering something to someone. Honestly, I don't think he sleeps." Nonplussed by her sudden flash of emotion, Istola and Lise glanced at one another before bursting out laughing. Alice glared at them, her face a picture of indignation. "Forgive us," said Istola with a twinkle in her eye. "We're but impressed by how closely you follow your hero's every act. What's that supposed to—" "I simply asked what manner of training he undertakes. For all the good it did me, none of it is anything I can reasonably emulate." "Well, I for one wholeheartedly approve of your choice of role model," said Lise, nodding sagely. "You too, Lise? If you want to talk about an interesting choice of role model, you should look no further than my brother." Bringing her fork to bear on her tart, Alice proceeded to recount her time in Yanxia. While Lisa's party traveled to the Azim Steppe in search of Lord Hien, Alice and Alphino had remained at the House of the Fierce. During that time, her bookish brother had helped to solve the Liberation Front's frequent shortages with a brand of wisdom that could only be described as useful. When I asked what had prompted him to turn his mind to practical matters, he told me he had met a man who taught him much and more of the road, and that he did not wish to seem idle should their paths cross again. Naturally, he wouldn't say who this mystery man was, only that he saw him as a brother, as if I needed another brother to contend with. Alice punctuated the statement by plunging her fork into her tart. Lise received the tale of Alphino's change with earnest interest, while Istola, having an inkling as to this object of admiration, could only smile wryly. Being a man ungiven to sentiment, she knew the knowledge that he was missed would do little to hasten his return. The waitress appeared with Lisa's drink, a glass of lemonade made with honey lemons from Othard. The first sip made her eyes light up, and she followed it with a longer draught. Seeing Lisa's enjoyment took Istola back to her earliest days in Limsa Lominsa, when she was just beginning to discover the city-state's renowned gastronomic culture. For all the culinary knowledge stored in Charlene's vast libraries, nothing could replicate the experience of enjoying a delicacy in its native land. "So how fare you, Lise? Has the rebuilding effort begun in earnest?" Istola's question snapped Lise back to reality, and she lowered both gaze and glass. "Sort of. There's no end to the problems, and they're not the kind I can punch. Thinking was always Papalimo's department. I mean, I'm doing my best, but, well, things rarely go to plan." Absently, she ran a finger over the droplets on her glass. "I still catch myself wondering, what would Father do? What would Edith say? Why am I not like them? And I end up making myself depressed." Hearing her own words, Lise tutted and fixed Istola with a determined stare. "But I won't give up. Not after everything it took to get this far." Seeing the fire in Lisa's eyes, Istola could not help but be reminded of Ida when she spoke of liberating her homeland, all those years ago. How proud she would have been. Letting out a sigh, Alice placed a second slice of tart on Lisa's plate. "But I haven't finished the—" "You need to keep up your strength," Istola declared in a tone that brooked no argument.
We all know that working hard makes you hungry, as does being serious, as does thinking in circles. Lisa's shoulders slumped. Gods, I'm not that bad, am I? Ishtola settled the matter by serving her another slice. Should you doubt yourself, do not hesitate to lean on those around you. Upon us, you have more than the memories of your family to call upon, Lise. Remember that. Thus reminded, Lise found her smile again. While attending to the contents of her well-populated plate, Lise reported on the recent happenings in her life. I've made a new friend, she began through a mouthful of tart. A boy about my age, who used to be in the resistance. He, knows everything there is to know about Alamegan politics and history, all the stuff I'm hopeless with, basically. It's, actually thanks to him that I had time to come here today. He helped me dig up some old records on a mine I'd been searching for. She paused mid-chew, eyebrows furrowed. But he has this queer habit of looking straight past me. I thought he might have a lazy eye at first, but no, he just won't meet my gaze. I don't know what to make of it. I expect he's daunted, Alice posited, and small wonder, you're a hero. Ishtola rolled her eyes. Children, must I spell it out? The boy is smitten with you. Lise greeted this revelation with a shower of crumbs and no small amount of coughing. You're joking, she finally managed. Yes, I am famed for my sense of humor, Ishtola agreed, her face stony. But were that not the case, you might entertain the thought. Unless, of course, your heart is already spoken for. The handsome young lord of Doma was of similar age, was he not? What? He? No, I admire him and all, but so do lots of people. And I might know someone who admires him especially. Lisa's gaze floated off into the distance along with her thoughts. She said no more on the subject, and the others did not pry. As if to signal the end of her report, she gave her lemonade a hearty stir before narrowing her eyes at Ishtola. What about you, Ishtola? What do you think of, Lise searched about for a suitable candidate. Thancred, maybe. Or one of the others. I can honestly say that they have never crossed my mind. If you must know, however, at that moment a memory came to her unbidden. She was convalescing at the Rising Stones after her disastrous encounter with Xenos when her sister paid a visit. Though glad of her preservation, this latest brush with death had plainly come too soon after the livestream episode for Amitra's liking, and she proceeded to rebuke her over the willful disregard she had shown for her own well-being. Her sister knew how dedicated she was to her chosen path, and would ordinarily have left it at a few stern words, but this time they burst forth as a torrent, knowing no cease until she sent Amitra away, pleading weariness. It was then that her sister had wearily spoken the words. Is it not past time you found someone? Strong you may be, but how much stronger might you prove with another at your side? The words resounded in Ishtola's mind as she drained her tea. Beyond the cup, she spied the other two leaning forward in ill-conceived anticipation. She flashed them a curt smile. Nay, mayhap it is better that I keep my own counsel. Lisa and Alice fell back with a groan and set about grumbling. Ignoring them, Ishtola reached for the teapot. Her hand stopped short as her ears discerned familiar footfalls. 'Twould seem our gathering is finally complete. In unison, the three scions turned to look, and sure enough, it was him, the warrior of light. So shall we order more of everything? The afternoon was yet young. Carried aloft by icy winds, the piping voice of a distant soldier drifted across the locks. Oh, this cred'll make a coffer when the wager pays off. Or this cred'll make a coffin when the wager falls through. Pippin knew the song well, as did every Uldan over a certain age. It told the tale of a youth on the way to seek his fortune in the Golden City, with only a box for company. His perilous journey through the wilds was depicted as a spirited roll of the dice, an invitation to Northal to fill his burdensome crate with gold, or failing that, his mortal remains. The marshal had always doubted that the hero of the tale had won his wager, largely because the song had been a favorite of his father's, and he could not think of the man without bracing himself for some impending disaster. In stark contrast to his adoptive parent, Pippin's birth father was an abject failure, an inveterate gambler and a drunk who would sooner sell his own son than repay a debt with his own sweat. A man who had, in fact, done just that. Pippin had been 12 years old at the time, busily sorting rocks at the mine when he was accosted by a brawny Lanista. Come boy, you belong to me now, and the blood sands ever thirst. And before he knew what was happening, the young Lalafell found himself sprawled on the floor of a cramped stone cell in the gladiator stables. Days of ceaseless drudgery were to follow. Every morning he was awoken at the crack of dawn to perform chores for the old fighters, and when those duties were done, He could look forward to hours in the practice yard under the gaze of the merciless drill master, the slightest mistake corrected by the snap of a whip or the thud of a cudgel. The only thing Pippin didn't hate about his new life was the food. A gladiator's body was an investment, and the Lanista wanted his charges fit and strong to bring home his share of the prize money. Even the novices were provided with hearty meals, great slabs of bread and fist-sized chunks of meat swimming in broth. Better still, the cook was liberal in his use of spices, treating Pippin's palate to a world of flavors he never knew existed. But beyond that single pleasure, the pain of each passing day seemed ever more difficult to bear. Pippin wasn't sure how long he could endure the grueling routine, and even if he did, there was no guarantee that he would survive his first match on the sands. I am no better than a slave. Desperate to escape, Pippin watched and waited for a chance to run away, but the drill master never once seemed to relax his guard. It seemed there was no way out but the grave. Then, after a year of back-breaking labor and bone-crunching training, he was ordered to serve as an attendant to one of the stable's champions. It was a meeting that would change Pippin's life forever, though it hardly seemed momentous at the time. "How old are you, lad?" 13. The gladiator seemed satisfied with Pippin's answer, and made no further effort to engage him in conversation during their walk to one of the Colosseum's antechambers. Unsure if the rugged Highlander was nervous before his match, or merely a man of few words, the boy resolved to hold his tongue. Gladiators could be a foul-tempered lot, and Pippin did not wish to earn himself a clip around the ear for breaking this one's focus. Even after arriving in the antechamber, the Highlander said nothing save for a few terse instructions. Pippin carried them out wordlessly, helping to strap the gladiator into his armor before finally proffering his helm, a piece styled to resemble a bull's horned head. The towering hero plucked it from his hands as if it weighed nothing, pulled it on, and strode out into the arena. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen, I give you Rabban Alden, the Bull of Alamigo." The ringing voice of the Colosseum herald was answered by a thunderous roar that shook the walls of the antechamber. Pippin was dumbfounded. This Bull of Alamigo had merely to set foot on the sands to send the spectators into a frenzy. In the months that followed, Pippin often found himself acting as Rabban's attendant. Though the gladiator was reticent at first, their stilted exchanges gradually grew longer, and the pair came to share the details of their past. The Highlander spoke of his birth in the land of Alamigo, and of the battles he had fought, of his people's rebellion against the tyrannous king, and of the Garlean Empire's subsequent invasion. He told of how he had fled his homeland, desperate and wounded, of how he had stumbled through the wilds until he reached the city of Ul'dah, where he was imprisoned on suspicion of espionage, and now here he was, a Colosseum champion fighting for his freedom before a crowd who chanted his name. It seemed inexplicable to Pippin that a man of Rabban's strength and charisma had been forced into the brutal life of a gladiator, but the thought did not bring him despair. On the contrary, he was encouraged by the idea that a slave of the Blood Sands might win enough purses to purchase his own emancipation, that he could be the master of his own fate. If my fellow slave can buy his freedom, then why not me? His purpose clear at last, Pippin attended to his training with new determination. He would survive. He would be free. Here it is. I have the final payment in my hand. The look of triumph on Rabban's face as he strode back into the antechamber would linger long in Pippin's memory. The Highlander seemed happier than after all of his previous victories combined, and little wonder. Never was a prize more well-deserved, Pippin exclaimed, beaming. He need never set foot on the Blood Sands again. The mere thought of it made him giddy, but in that same moment came the realization, the certainty that the man who had so transformed his outlook, the mentor in whose footsteps he longed to tread, would soon be gone. "Why are you frowning, lad?" Rabban asked, confused. "You're free." Now it was Pippin's turn to look confused. They stood frozen for a moment in an awkward tableau, a hawking gladiator clutching a bulging prize purse staring down in consternation at an equally puzzled Lalafell youth. "I'm saying you needn't risk your life anymore," Rabban went on, a hint of exasperation in his voice. "Most young gladiators never get to be old. Pit two against each other, and both are apt to end up dead. I would spare you that fate." Realization finally dawned. Over the months since their first meeting, the Highlander had not been setting his winnings against the price of his own freedom. He has been paying off father's debt. Pippin's eyes filled with tears as fear and exhaustion, his constant companions for a year and more, were swept away by waves of relief and gratitude. He would toil for the Lanista no longer. The following morning, Pippin stood alone at the gates to the gladiator stables, his meager possessions gathered in a small burlap sack. Raban could not leave his cell, and it seemed that neither the drill master nor the lanista cared much for a youth in whose future they had no further investment. Pippin walked out onto the street. The desert sun had scarcely broken the horizon, and the cobblestones felt cool beneath his feet. Free. He took 3 deliberate steps, savoring his unexpected liberation, and then settled into a stroll. But with every footfall along the empty thoroughfare, he became more aware of the niggling doubt in his belly. What if father wagers all on another losing cause? His wine-sodden sire had already shown a willingness to sell off his only child. There was nothing to prevent him from doing it again. Never. Pippin came to an abrupt stop, turned on his heels, and set off back the way he had come. Pippin, lad, I thought you'd be long gone by now. Raban tilted his head as the small figure at the door to his cell took a deep breath. I wish to continue my training as a gladiator, Pippin declared, his voice clear and unwavering. I am grateful for all you have done for me, but I will never truly be free until I have the strength to free myself. Pippin duly explained how his father might very well sell him as chattel once more, and that he would rather be the master of his own destiny, however brutal, and learn at the feet of a man he truly respected than live in fear. Raban gave his answer with a fierce grin. Though well acquainted with the man's generosity, Pippin was nevertheless astonished by what the gladiator did next. Pippin's father, it transpired, had signed a contract when handing over his son to the lanista, transferring all his rights and obligations as the boy's legal guardian. Drawing on his prize money, Raban bought this document from Pippin's former owner and invoked the guardian clause, thus beginning formal adoption proceedings. In the years that followed, the pair lived together as imprisoned father and emancipated son. A curious arrangement to be sure, but one which allowed Pippin to resume his study of the blade under Raban's decidedly less callous tutelage. But despite Pippin's protestations, his adoptive father would not permit him to fight on the sands. Raban swore, however, that his path would be his own to choose once he came of age. Now 25 years old, seasoned by a stint as a mercenary, Pippin was an officer of the Immortal Flames, fighting to reclaim Raban's beloved homeland. You risked much and more to see me thrive, father, Pippin said, unsheathing Tizona's heavy blade, and I will see that your wager pays off.
Ours is the soil. Come and listen to my tale. A tale of a brother most radiant. At this, the young men gathered around the fire chuckled. Most radiant indeed. But like all great tales, it began long, long ago. At the beginning, with a father, a mother, a step, and a people. From the forbidding heights of the Tail Mountains flow many Ka which wind their way to Azim Khat. And upon this Khat rests a great stone monument, a sacred fortress forged by the Dawn Father himself, a throne upon which his children might bask in the sun. In its shadow lived a proud, strong people, they who were descended from Azim, they who were destined to rule, the Oranir. And among the Oranir lived a boy born for great things. More chuckling, followed by a hushing noise. Magni was his name, a full measure bigger and quieter than most youths his age, possessed of a fearsome strength that rivaled that of a full-grown warrior. He could carry a half-dozen pails of milk with ease, and wield an axe twice his size as if it were a hatchet. So talented was he that he often joined the men in their hunts, leading them to laugh and proclaim that Magni was destined to be named the most radiant. Such things would be decided in the brotherly contest, of course, but still they patted his head and showered him with praise, which he enjoyed as any boy would. But what the young warrior loved to hear most of all were the tales of antiquity. Again and again he would pester the storytellers to recount the oldest of them all, that of the father and the mother, their war, and their children. With wide eyes and open ears, he would sit as the elders spoke of the love that had blossomed between the children of Azim and Nama, and how the gods had come to share in it as well, of how the gods could never be together, and of how the avatar of Azim, he of Midnight Scale, came to dwell amongst Nama's children as protector, giving rise to the Oranir. Every time the storyteller reached the conclusion of the tale, Magni would nod powerfully in affirmation and return to his training without a word, his resolve forged anew. Until one day, after the tale had been told, Brother Magni asked a question. Elder, how will I know when I have met my Nama? Magni's question, of course, stemmed from the Oranir belief that the Dusk Mother, upon seeing the children of the Dawn Father, shed tears of love and longing, which upon striking the ground, rose up as counterparts to the men. For every sun, there would be a moon. For every Azim, a Nama. Surprised, the storyteller began to tell Magni of how he met his true love, but Magni grew restless. for the humble tale was a far cry from the ancient legends he held in such high regard. So Magnai went and asked his older brothers, "How will I know when I have met my Nama?" "In the markets," one said, "our eyes had but to meet, and it was plain." "On the hunt," said another, "when I saw her draw her bow, I knew at once that it was her." He heard many such tales, a chance meeting, a shared glance, and then all was as it should be. But like the storyteller before them, their accounts told Magnai nothing. From the smiling faces of those men who had been shown favor by the gods, who had gone forth and met their moons, he gleaned no secret wisdom. But Magnai was a boy of faith. In his heart he knew that he was bound by fate to a woman of the dusk, and that when they met, they would both know. Magnai's thoughts often turned to his Nama and what sort of person she might be. The steppe is vast, and the Zela many. She could be anywhere, among any tribe he feared. Now Magnai had many sisters, and they were no less formidable than he. Whenever he tried to sneak away to play, in neglect of his chores, they would not rest until they had tracked him down. Once discovered, he would whine and protest, for he cared not for such menial tasks, but they saw to it that he completed each and every one, for which he liked them not at all. One day, as he sullenly tended to wool freshly dyed by his elder sisters, he mused that his moon would never raise her voice to him as they did. Nay, she would be a gentle, ethereal maiden. Aye, that would be the perfect wife. Later, Magnai was sent out alone by his sisters to bring home a lost lamb. As the burning sun sank low on the horizon, the boy came upon a horde of howgai, thick as summer grass, drawn by the bleating of his quarry. He waded through the beast and saved the lamb, of course, but by then the stars were out, and Magnai had no choice but to take shelter amidst the rocks with the animal and wait out the freezing night. He woke as the Dawnfather's growing light began to blot out that of the stars. He watched as the world was transformed by the grace of Azem, as the sky grew brighter and brighter, like the cheeks of a blushing maiden, and the sight filled his heart with joy. He mused that his moon would be this beautiful, and to look on her would be to relive this moment. She would be a dancer in the morning mist. A groan followed by a burst of laughter. Aye, that would be the perfect wife. Years passed, and the young warrior grew bigger and stronger, and when he was old enough to join in the brotherly contest, he won with ease and was named the eldest. Brimming with power and pride, he led the Oranir to victory in the Nadam, and upon him were heaped still greater accolades. None were more fit to wear Midnight's scale than he, the most radiant of Azem's sons, the sworn protector of the Zela. But for all his triumphs, for all his glory, he had yet to find his Nama. There were maidens who made overtures, of course, but Magnai was particular, very particular. Not her, he would say, not her, and before long none would even bother to approach him. One after another, brothers of the same age found their moons, while Magnai sat his throne and brooded, his mood growing fouler with each passing day. Seeing this, one of the younger offered a suggestion. "Most radiant brother Magnai, 'twas you who led the Oranir to victory in the Nadam, you who claimed the Dawn Throne, you who rose above all others on the steppe. Surely it is within your power to demand that the maidens of these lands come before you, is it not? Let us send horse and yole to the far corners of the steppe, and by the grace of Father Azem, they will return with your Nama." It was, Magnai saw, a wise suggestion. Many maidens of the steppe answered Magnai's call. In the shadow of the Dawn Throne, they gathered to present themselves to the Most Radiant, who sat in a grand pavilion with an expression most severe. At his shoulder stood one of the younger, who leaned forward and whispered in his ear, "Most Radiant brother Magnai, I give you the fairest maidens of the steppe. I have no doubt that one among them is descended from the tears of the Dust Mother and destined to stand at your side." At this, Magnai nodded, before rising from his seat to inspect the line of women. He looked from left to right, studying their faces. Some looked on him with awe, others with unease, others still with disgust, but his eye was quickly drawn to one above all the rest. Despite the mask she wore to cover her mouth, her beauty was plain to see. She did not share whispers with those next to her, nor did she watch him with fear like some. She was calm and composed, and stood in silence, seemingly oblivious to his presence. Magnai was intrigued. "You there," he began, stepping forward. The woman, however, stepped back with a start. Alas, the Most Radiant had had few dealings with the Kestir, and was unaware that the woman had no interest in him, only his pavilion, which would surely have attracted many customers in reunion. Annoyed and confused, Magnai seized the woman's wrist. She froze, her eyes wide in terror. She was weak, and he was strong, and he could have easily crushed her arm, had that been his intention. He himself was surprised to discover this. Still, he held fast to the maiden's wrist. She was not unlike his sisters in stature, but she was graceful, and had yet to raise her voice to him. He felt his heart beat faster. Could she be the one, he wondered. Magni stared at her as if searching for the answer, searching for the color in her cheeks, waiting for her to lift her head and look into his eyes and reveal the moon of whom he had dreamt for so long. He would offer 1,000 prayers in the gods' names then and there, and that day he would make plans for the greatest wedding ceremony the steppe had ever seen. Oh, if only. For the trembling maiden, shrinking beneath Magni's steely gaze, burst into tears and shook her head fervently in refusal. And in that instant, a voice thick with venom, a voice like thunder, echoed around the steppe. There, you have your answer. Now let her go, unless you joy in making girls cry. All turned to the woman standing apart from the others, a woman clad in the blue of the undying ones, come not to offer herself, but to observe the farce. Fearless, she strode forward, white hair dancing in the breeze. She was Sadhu, Khatoon of the Dothal, who had fought many times against the Orinir for supremacy of the steppe. Eyes wide, nostrils flaring, Magni released the Kistiri maiden, who bowed her head in thanks to Sadhu and rejoined the other women, who were observing the coming confrontation at a distance. So this is the Orinir's new Khan. Though we did not meet on the field of battle, I heard tales of your feats, but none of your other appetites. How disappointing. Mannerless Geeton, do not presume to understand things of which you know nothing. Leave, or join the others if you will. The sun may yet show you favor. Sadhu bared her teeth in a grin, a blue-eyed Baras toying with her prey. She spied several Oriniri brothers approaching, and in a flash drew forth her staff and set the earth ablaze. The younger shrank back in fear, and the other women fled, but to his credit, Magni merely frowned. Ha! It seems I have frightened away all your little moons, or maybe they were grateful for the excuse. She spread her arms wide and raised her chin, as if basking in the heat of her flames. Your victory changes nothing. The world will not bend to your whims, much less we Dothal. She lowered her head and her eyes were full of murder and joy. A brother raced to his side and pressed his great axe into his hands before withdrawing once more, for this was between the Khan and the Khatoon. One day, he was heard to whisper then, one day I shall find you, my love, my lady of the dusk, my ethereal maiden, my dancer in the morning mist. 3 days and 3 nights their battle raged, for as long as the Orinir had fought to claim the Dawn Throne. In the end, however, neither one could best the other. Sadhu Khatoon returned home to lick her wounds and dream of vengeance. And the most radiant brother? He too returned to his home, to the brothers whose happiness he still envied, and the throne he would sit alone. All alone. But who can say what the future holds? Ensconced in the private room of a tavern, a courtesan poured a cup of wine for a gentleman with practiced grace. Tedious wretch, Yotsuyu cursed inwardly, betraying no hint of irritation. She had thought this simple man of war would be less resistant to her charms. Over the course of an evening, she would use drink and desire to erode her mark's defenses, drawing out secrets one by one before serving the most delicious morsels to her employer. As an imperial spy, it was an act she had performed 100 times, and this night was meant to be no different. But her guest was not cooperating. Zenos Yegalvis, legatus of the 12th Imperial Legion, was clearly disinclined to trust his host from the dome and garrison. Despite the warmth of the sitting room, he had made no move to shed his armor, receiving his cup with the gauntlet in hand. His eyes were dull and focused on nothing, and yet in their depths she discerned a muted glimmer of anticipation. What are you waiting for? Originally, Yotsuyu's masters had assigned her a different mission. Lord Kyan, Doma's former ruler, was reported to have assembled an army, and it seemed an uprising was imminent. Thus had she been tasked with infiltrating the ranks of the rebellion. She was to offer them military intelligence, supposedly gleaned from imperial visitors to her establishment, and play the part of a devoted patriot, willing to risk her life to gather vital information. Once in place, she would instead funnel the rebel army's plans back to the Empire. A betrayal of her kith and kin to be sure, though the courtesan felt not the slightest shred of remorse. Was it not her closest kin, her foster parents and her late husband, who had made her life a living hell, and none who witnessed this treatment had lifted a finger in her defense. As far as Yotsuyu was concerned, her countrymen were complicit in her abuse and deserving of the same punishment as her abusers. Yet on the day she was to begin the operation, the garrison's intelligence officer called her back. They had received word that an imperial legatus would shortly be arriving from the capital to assess the situation in Doma. Lord Zenos was his name, one she had heard before. With Emperor Solus on his deathbed, a clandestine war of succession was already beginning to wage in Garlemald. Solus's eldest being dead, his grandson Varus was next in line to the throne, but the Emperor's second son Titus had other ideas, and no shortage of support. What he did not have, however, was Varys' standing with the military, nor less a ready heir, this Xenos. As a public ally of Titus, the Viceroy plainly considered the legatus a threat, Yotsuyu saw, and the fact that they would entrust her with so important a target bespoke how high she had risen in their esteem. Finally, some recognition. She favored the intelligence officer with a wintry smile. I understand Kyan and his fledgling rebellion have yet to be stamped out. Could it be that the Viceroy's superiors are unsatisfied with this lack of progress? Yotsuyu feigned a look of sympathy. How galling it must be to have a political rival travel all this way just to prod one's sorest spots. The officer frowned in consternation. We are well aware that Doma's present troubles afford our opponents an opportunity to undermine our position. But this visit also affords us an opportunity, he continued, fixing Yotsuyu with a meaningful stare. If we were to tease from Xenos some insight into his father's plans, we may yet emerge from this exchange with the upper hand. It's all the same to me, Yotsuyu purred. Another man, another evening. He passes the night in bliss, and I steal every word that falls from his careless tongue. Simple. They had treated her like cattle, but now she held the switch. She had no taste for the sweet nothings men showered upon her. It was the spectacle of their graceless slide into self-destruction which sated her vengeful appetite, at least for a time. Yet the plans of both Yotsuyu and the Viceroy were defeated at the outset by Xenos' unshakable lassitude. The visiting legatus barely spared his host a glance as he lounged with obvious boredom on the cushions provided. Having braced himself for a humiliating examination of his failures, the Viceroy withdrew in some confusion, leaving Yotsuyu to attend to the needs of his guest. The hour grew late, and Xenos emptied his cup again and again, but the wine may as well have been water for all the effect it seemed to have upon him. Will the man never get drunk? Yotsuyu wondered in exasperation. Then, just as she had begun to contemplate simply throwing herself naked into his lap, he spoke. What manner of place is this Doma? The courtesan hesitated at the sudden question. She had no shortage of answers, of course, and could gladly wax lyrical upon the shortcomings of her despised birthplace until dawn. But her task was to unburden her target of his secrets, not unburden herself. At least he's talking. I'll loosen that tongue yet. As she looked up, however, the perfunctory response she had prepared died in her throat. The eyes which had spent the evening staring past her now bored into the depths of her soul. I am weary of empty chatter, he warned. Tell me instead how such a face came to hide such bitterness. The tale may serve to amuse me. Such a blunt manner you have, my lord, Yotsuyu quipped, unwilling to relinquish her facade. Shall we blame the sake for this breach of etiquette? Xenos merely stared in silence. It was plain he had no intention of acknowledging her deflection. Rather than feel discomfited, however, Yotsuyu found herself spellbound, the glare of his undivided attention captivating in its brilliance. In an instant of clarity, she understood. This man will go far. The sound of falling rain seeped into her consciousness. A sudden hammering downpour that dissolved the moment which had held her frozen. But a connection had been made. The briefest stay in Doma will tell you all you need to know, my lord, Yotsuyu began. Yanksha is a dunghill. Xenos drained the rest of his cup and leaned forward with interest. Ah, there you are. It intrigues me to see a woman struggle with such rage when tradition dictates that she appear meek. Tradition, the courtesan spat. My countrymen strangle themselves with the shackle of worn-out customs and formalities. Their eyes bulge and their limbs spasm, and still they cling to precious notions of honor and sacrifice. Now that she had given voice to her hatred, the words came spilling forth unbidden. A deluge which would have continued unabated had Xenos not risen to his feet. His eyes seemed to seek something beyond the walls of the tavern. Waiting on the storm to cover their approach, he murmured. I was curious to hear more of your story, but the evening's true entertainment has arrived. What? Yotsuyu had barely uttered the question when the nearby window exploded inwards. Ears ringing from the noise, she registered several black-clad forms clambering in through the breach. The intruders drew blades and surrounded Xenos with appalling swiftness. Yotsuyu, meanwhile, scrambled backwards in a crouch and took in the unfolding scene. Assassins, she realized coldly, and not terribly discreet ones. They addressed themselves in the garb of shinobi, but their swords and the manner in which they held them were distinctly imperial. Bastards, she screamed, furious at her own gullibility. They sent me in here to die. Not one of the masked killers so much as glanced in her direction. Xenos himself seemed unconcerned, bored even as he surveyed the naked steel arrayed against him. Making no move to retrieve his own sword propped out of reach against the wall, the legatus calmly addressed the room. Lord Xenos, slain in the arms of a Doman courtesan. Yes, such a scandal is worth the ignominy of failing to protect a royal guest. His lips curled into a humorless smile, and should Doma's fugitive ruler be implicated in the plot, all the better. The viceroy would have his reinforcements within a week. The assassins remained mute as they edged closer and closer. In the next instant they were upon him, blades flashing in synchrony, their tightening circle obscuring his armored form from Yatsuyu's view. Bracing for the inevitable, she was momentarily confused when each of the attackers seemed to pause in unison before slumping lifeless to the floor. As they fell, Zenos appeared to her to rise from the tangle of black-clad limbs like a vengeful angel, but in truth he stood motionless, his expression unchanged. In one hand he held an assassin's sword. How? Yatsuyu gaped in disbelief, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. She could but assume that he had seized the blade at the last moment and felled the entire band with one impossible cut. I had hoped that a land on the brink of rebellion might offer some measure of sport. The legatus looked down at his fallen opponents and grunted in annoyance. But if the viceroy imagines a handful of hired knives sufficient to remove me from the hunt, I have sorely overestimated my prey. Yatsuyu felt something warm trickle down her cheek. Unthinking, she raised a hand to wipe it away and was bemused to find her finger stained red. Glancing down at her kimono, she saw that it was splattered with blood. Why do you smile? Looking up, she noticed the legatus gazing upon her once more, and realized that she was indeed smiling. Of the many imperial officers she had encountered, some reputed great men, not one seemed so assured of his own power, nor so uninterested in projecting it. Should this strength be brought to bear upon Doma, a wretched nation would finally meet the end it deserved. Zenos' eyes narrowed at her widening grin, and he strode uncaring over the bodies of her slain to bring his lips close to her blood-streaked face. What is your name? He breathed, voice scarcely above a whisper. When morning came, no mention of the failed assassination attempt was made, and Yatsuyu duly returned to a mission to infiltrate the rebel forces. Days turned into weeks, and when the heady rush of that blood-soaked evening had at last begun to fade, Kyan staged his long-planned rebellion. Predictably, the Doman viceroy could not contain the revolt, and the 12th Legion was dispatched to intervene. After sweeping through Yanksha, Zenos defeated Kyan himself in single combat, and the rebellion crumbled soon after. Among the crowd of haggard onlookers encouraged to watch the 12th Legion's subsequent victory parade through the Enclave, a courtesan stood unregarded. She had eyes only for the man who marched at the head of the procession, his features blank and unchanging under the bitter scrutiny of the Doman citizenry. And when she slipped away to follow behind the soldiers, there were none who noted her absence. Some few days later, the acting viceroy who would rule over the lands of Doma and Zenos' stead was announced, a woman by the name of Yatsuyu. The power was hers now, to taunt, torment, and torture every miserable soul who huddled in her hated domain. Draped in an elegant kimono and twirling a slender pipe, she looked down from the walls of Doma Castle and smiled. The breeze that caressed the ruined palace seemed tinged with gold. More than anything else, it was said that the great worm Ratatoskr loved to weave songs, and the eldritch power of her verses still lingered here, 1,000 years after her voice was forever silenced by the treachery of mortals. In the wake of her death, the dragons had named her home in the clouds Sor Kai, words which mean grieving apology, out of guilt over their failure to protect her, and left the place untouched. A lone figure took in the scene before kneeling to lay a bouquet. I know I make for a strange messenger, but the war is over. It was, he conceded, an awkward utterance, but how could it be otherwise? What else could he say to the she-worm whose murder had kindled the flames of the Dragon Song War, he whose sole purpose in life had been to hunt her kind? Sorry? Even as he struggled to fashion an apology, a sudden gust scattered his offering of flowers, sending petals billowing in all directions. I did not expect to find thee here as your dragoon. Estinian did not so much hear the voice as feel it echoing inside his mind, but he both heard and felt the beating of mighty wings that followed. Looking up, he beheld a familiar white form descending. Racevelger, so much for privacy. Following Nidhogg's defeat and his miraculous rescue upon the steps of faith, Estinian had remained in the Holy See only long enough to witness his old friend Emmerich appointed Lord Speaker of the House of Lords. He had then quietly taken his leave, not with the mind to forsake his homeland, but to ponder how he might serve it in this new age. With the war at an end, he reasoned, his presence was no longer required. There was no place for a man who had spilled as much dragon blood as he, much less one who had turned lance and fang upon his own people as his enemy's thrall. Where to then for Ishgard's unwanted champion? Estinian could think of several places, and so he had embarked upon a journey. To the ruins of Ferndale, the village of his birth, to offer a prayer to his beloved mother, father, and little brother, Hamingnat. To a cliff overlooking the capital, to give thanks to the knight brave and true, whose sacrifice had kept Ishgard's hope alive. To the floating continent Azizla, to pay tribute to the maiden of conviction, who blazed a path for her comrades by burning the candle of her life. His old self would have never contemplated such a sentimental journey, but times had changed, and so had he. Last of all, he had come to Sorkai, to voice his regret to the long-departed Ratatoskr, a visit he had hoped would go unnoticed. Spying ill becomes you, worm, Estinian growled. The great worm's muzzle contorted into what must have been a smile. Ah, do I intrude? I but desired to show mine appreciation for thy gesture. My brood sister would have welcomed it. For a time, Estinian's soul had been merged with that of Nidhogg, the dread worm's tumultuous storm of emotions commingling with his own. The rancor, the fury, the grief, he had felt it all, and the grief lingered even now. The gulf left behind by Ratatoskr's passing was one he knew as well as any man or dragon, and thus were Hraesvelgr's words more comforting than the worm realized. I am owed no such kindness, but thank you, Estinian replied, his voice catching in his throat. Gathering himself, he continued, and for what it's worth, I am Azure Dragoon no longer. This age has no need of my lance. At this, the great worm's eyes narrowed. And yet there it is upon thy back, fair dripping with my brood brother's essence. The observation caught him wholly unawares. When he had left Ishgard behind, he had done so without his dragoon's armor, deeming it a relic of a former life. Yet somehow it had not occurred to him to likewise lay down his lance, warped though it was by Nidhogg's power. Estinian's confoundment was plain to Hraesvelgr, and when he spoke, it was in tones tinged with the faintest trace of pity. Thy fight is not over, mortal, as thou knowest only too well. The sting of another realization. Damn you, worm. He had the right of it, of course. Azure Dragoon or no, there was still work to be done. Purpose even for a lance tempered and honed in an unjust war. If thou wouldst swear to fight for man and dragon both, then come with me. Unto thee I shall bequeath armor befitting a true dragoon. Without waiting for a response, Hraesvelgr leapt into the sky with a powerful kick, his tattered wings bearing him away so swiftly that his looming form soon became no more than a speck in the heavens. Snapping out of his reverie, Estinian dashed to his mana cutter and took off in pursuit. After a brief flight, they came to a cluster of ruins upon the fringes of Sorkai, a stable for wyverns during the forgotten days of harmony, Estinian guessed. There the great worm landed, and after he had followed suit, Hraesvelgr nodded towards the heart of the ruins. They had not walked far when Estinian caught sight of what he knew at once to be their destination. By the fury. Inside what appeared to be the remains of a barracks built for men sat several armory chests. All bore the scars of the inexorable march of time save one, a pristine example preserved by some manner of draconic enchantment. Estinian needed no further encouragement. As he approached the chest, Hraesvelgr broke the silence. In the beginning, dragoons were men who fought beside dragons, not against them. Ratatoskr took great pleasure in bearing such fearless souls upon her back, and thus did she bless their armor with her power. Lifting the lid, Estinian's jaw fell open. Before him lay not one, but two magnificent suits of plate armor. Their hue was all too familiar. Azure, gods forgive me. At first, men felt honored to receive such gifts, but the more power they received, the more they craved, and all too soon naught save the source of that power would sate them. And so they butchered her, devoured her eyes like feral beasts. The armor of the first dragoons, brimming with power freely given. The mere sight of it made Estinian's heart swell, but he made no move to claim his prize. Why, he said at length, why grant me this power? What makes you think I am any different from Thorin and the rest? At this the worm paused, head lowered, before answering softly. A maiden did give me cause to believe in thy kind once more. Only after another lengthy silence did he continue. Never was this armor worn. It wanteth for a master, a true dragoon. Thou hast cast aside one azure. If thou wouldst take up another, it is thine. A short while later, Estinian emerged from the barracks with new armor and newfound purpose. The azure plate gleamed brilliantly as it caught the light of the midday sun. Such armor deserves a name, he declared, and I know one which befits it well. Hraesvelgr stared at him expectantly. Iceheart. for it shall watch over a man ignorant of all things save how to wield a lance steeped in anger." At these words, Racevelger threw back his head and let loose a mighty roar, both of approval and amusement. The dragoon had chosen well. When Estinian finally left the churning mist, his feet carried him almost of their own volition towards the battlefield once more, there to cut a path for his comrades whose struggles yet continued. Time went by, and the war for Alamigo's liberation found the forces of the Eorzean Alliance at the fortress city's doorstep. From his cliffside vantage point, Estinian watched as the host wended its way through the locks, a great serpent with soldiers for scales. Though they were too far away to see, he doubted not but that his comrades were among them. Emmerich, Alphino, the warrior of light. He had silenced the monstrous cannon at Castrum Abania to pave their way, the final act of casting down the Garleans he left to them. Something else demanded his attention, a matter for him alone. Make that two matters, he inwardly corrected. Spent of ether as they were, it had been no easy task to track them down. As the final battle was joined and his friends fought on, he quietly intercepted a squadron of flying armor that was moving to flank them. It was then that he felt the call, a power he knew as intimately as he knew himself, emanating from the skies high above the royal palace. Pulling the tip of his lance free of a smoldering wreck, he struck out at a brisk run, making his way through the unfolding chaos. But by the time he finally emerged in the gardens of the royal menagerie, it was all over, all save his own task. Even without seeing them, he knew exactly where they lay. Striding through the exotic flowers, heedless of their beauty, he came to a halt at a patch like any other. And there they were, Nidhogg's eyes staring blindly up at him. "Well, well, well. What a fine mess we've made," he greeted them as old friends. "All but spent feeding that primal, eh? Well, you won't be making any mischief with that amount of ether." He drew his lance, named for his nemesis and the dragon he himself once was, and aimed its deadly point at one helpless eyeball. Still, better safe than sorry. Bracing himself, body and soul, he plunged into the eye. It gave way readily, turning into black mist and disappearing into the crimson sky. Wasting no time, he then consigned its twin to the selfsame fate. There ends your hateful legacy. Thus did Estinian's journey come to an end, a journey which has seen him revisit the past and in so doing find a future. His lifelong battle having reached its true conclusion, he could finally begin anew. None can say whither his road will lead, whether the skies that greet him will be the striking blue of day, the blazing crimson of dusk, or the deepening black of twilight. Yet wheresoever he should find himself, one thing is certain: he will ever wield his lance for man and dragon both. The mood in the Flame's carriage was worthy of a wake. While pretending to gaze out at the parched landscape of southern Thanalan, the youth tried in vain to think of something to say. Across from him sat the Grand Company's recently formed Summoner Squad, the doughty souls charged with combating primal threats, none of whom had said a word since their departure. Silently he rehearsed an opening line. "So, you lot brave or stupid, or both?" Although he and his had been dispatched to render aid in this mission, they had yet to establish a rapport with the soldiers, and he was determined to break the ice. "My name's Arnvald Lentinus," he eventually managed, and when no response was forthcoming, he added, "So, you lot fight primals often?" At this, the Lalafellan summoner sitting opposite shrugged wordlessly. "Why do I bother?" But then the woman next to him took pity and replied, "As often as circumstances warrant, I suppose. Crispin and I have battled Ifrit 4 times now," she said, gesturing at the third summoner who gamely accepted the conversational baton. "Though our experience pales in comparison to the lieutenant's. Jajasamu is formerly of the Company of Heroes, and he faced the Lord of the Crags, and lived. Ah, so he's the dab hand." The lieutenant glanced at him briefly before looking away again indifferent. "Probably wondering why you're riding with a pair of young nobodies." "Veterans then. That's a relief. I'll try not to get underfoot." As soon as the words had left his mouth, he regretted playing the part. "Useless bloody whelps. If you value your life, you'll do 2 things. Watch and learn," Jajasamu snapped before resuming his pre-battle ritual of ignoring one and all. "So that's the way it's gonna be, eh?" Arnvald stifled a sigh and forced a smile as he glanced sidelong at his fellow whelp, praying to the 12 that she wouldn't make matters worse. But if the lieutenant's words had struck a nerve, she didn't show it. Her eyes were closed, her face devoid of all tension, the very picture of serenity. The calm before the storm. Maybe the two of them had the right of it. Accepting defeat, Arnvald abandoned his brilliant plan to befriend the squad before the battle, and instead cast his mind back to the circumstances that had led him to share a carriage with the Summoners and Fordola Lupus. Fate and the Scions had conspired to bring him back to Alamigo, his homeland, and it was there that they had first met, as mortal enemies on the battlefield. The same age, the same birthplace, and yet somehow they had come to lead such different lives. He, the half-breed spawn of a Garlean soldier cast out by his mother, had left Garabania and become an adventurer, while she, a pure-blood daughter of Alamigo, had been gifted an imperial education and taken up arms against her own countrymen. Yet for everything we strove to escape, to deny, our past led us here. As a scion, he had earned the respect of the Resistance and the Alamigan people, whereas she, as a traitor and a kinslayer, had earned their scorn. Only death would answer death, they believed. Nor perhaps were they wrong. And then came the day they stood on the same side of a battlefield. Representatives had gathered from all across Garabania to discuss the future of Alamigo, only for proceedings to be plunged into chaos by a Nata treachery. Sri Lakshmi, summoned by the Kalyana, would have bound all present to her will were it not for the intervention of the Warrior of Light, Arnvald, and Fordola. "It's done. Take me back to my cell." With those words, Fordola had thrown down the sword Lise Hex put in her hands when the former scion had challenged the hated butcher to take her own life, as Xenos had, or use her newfound powers for a noble purpose. Arnvald watched them lead her away, watched as they once more debated the fate of his kinswoman and her fellow collaborators. In the end, it was Rauban who had proffered the solution: conscription. A new unit in which some convicts might serve out their sentence instead of in a cell or at the end of a rope. Though others were extended the offer, it was plain who they wanted most. Fordola had proven herself capable of withstanding primal influence. Her abilities as a resonant, coupled with her combat expertise, made her an invaluable asset in the never-ending war against the primals. A weapon. She agreed. "Out of the carriage, let's go, let's go!" The words of the Rogadan captain riding with the coachman dragged Arnvald back to the present. With practiced precision, the summoners grabbed their gear and disembarked, forming a line before their superior. Arnvald followed suit. "As you know, yesterday, Master Coltonet of the Scions informed us of an etheric disturbance in the vicinity of the Zonrock altar. Said disturbance can almost certainly be attributed to a primal summoning." The captain walked up and down the line, searching his soldiers' faces. "Luckily for us, we've got ourselves a couple of secret weapons." Arnvald felt their eyes upon him and Fordola. Arnvald of the Scions and Fordola of the Resistance, echo-blessed, the both of them, so no need to worry about them getting tempered. That said, I'm obliged to divulge certain details regarding the latter. He saw their faces darken as they listened, their eyes narrow, their bodies tense. Fordola cocked her head and chuckled. "If I was going to stab you, it'd be in the front, not the back. But don't worry your little heads, my neck's still in the hangman's noose." She tapped the gem-inlaid choker below her chin with 2 fingers. You can trust in words, or you can trust in magic. If the Resistance thaumaturge tasked with keeping an eye on Fordola was so inclined, he could trigger the enchantment woven into the neckpiece, causing it to gradually grow warmer and tighter, slowly searing her skin as it choked the life from her. Rather you than me. A proper hanging snap your neck at least. The captain cleared his throat and continued. "Given their talents, we'll have them hold Ifrit at bay while the summoner squad engages at range with Aegean magics. You'll have healers as support, as well as the girl's minder. I'll be directing the diversionary maneuvers to the south. Any questions?" "Right then." They left the Forgotten Springs en masse and ventured a few malms east into Sagoli before Captain Wolf and his contingent peeled off to lay siege to a nearby Amalja encampment, providing the summoner squad with the distraction they needed to head north towards the Zonrock altar undetected. Arnvald then led the way through a narrow canyon, clinging to the shadows some 50 yalms ahead of the party. Spying an oblivious sentry, he gestured for his comrades to stop and slowly drew his dagger. Wiping the blade clean, he looked back and signaled the others to join him. As one, they continued north towards the altar where they found, as they had feared, a ring of flame and the Lord of the Inferno waiting at his heart. Even in the aftermath, he struggled to remember the fight. The primal had been summoned with a token quantity of crystals, and Arnvald had not felt a fraction as hard-pressed as he had during the battle with Sri Lakshmi. The summoners and healers had all performed admirably, a victory won on the training ground, not the battlefield. "We're finished here. All units withdraw." At Captain Wolf's command, they set out to return the way they had come. "Advance no further." Arenval was already diving the moment he heard the scream. Peering out from cover, he saw a figure in the dirt clutching an arrow in his gut, his black iron point protruding obscenely from his back. Amonja. Stay put and stay quiet. Leave the fighting to me and Ali. Enemy archers, West Ridge, get behind those rocks. Arenval closed his eyes, took a breath, and counted to 4. Shafts were raining down all around them. Raising his shield, he broke and ran towards the summoners to help defend their retreat, and past Fordola sprinting in the opposite direction, sword flashing as she danced through a hail of arrows. I knew it! I knew she'd run, Jajasamu bellowed with a hint of triumph. Alarm bells ringing in his head, Arenval looked back and saw she was headed for the wounded soldier, a resistance man, the thaumaturge. But just as Arenval felt his stomach drop into his boots and the grip of his sword dig deep into his palm, he saw Fordola pull the mage to his feet and offer him a shoulder. And then Arenval was running again, this time into the open, his silver armor flashing in the sunlight as he shouted curses and threw stones at the archers on the ridge, daring them to face him. After a time, the arrows subsided and the archers vanished from sight. Better to leave the madman be, eh? For a moment he let himself relax. Keep your guard up, boy. Arenval caught the first arrow on his shield and drew his sword in time to cut down the second and the third. Sorry, Abba, he whispered. The archer, a hawking brute of an Amonja wearing a mask, took careful aim. Bugger it. With a cry, he raised his shield and charged, closing the gap and driving his full weight into his ill-prepared foe. As the archer staggered backward, Arenval raised his sword and brought it down, cleaving his enemy's bow in two as he raised it in a vain attempt to ward off the blow. The Amonja crumpled to the earth, and the surrounding sand grew dark and wet. The silence was deafening, and Arenval knew the champion's comrades had been watching. Bloody hells, that was the stupidest display of heroism I've seen in years, and they wonder why I hate the young ones. Muttering under his breath, the summoner bade his familiar return to him. As the floating mass of rock passed Arenval, he saw the masked Amonja's final arrow was lodged squarely in his breast. The mood in the flames' carriage was worthy of a name-day feast. The summoners all smiles as they chatted amongst themselves and even laughed at some of Arenval's jokes. Fordola sat apart from it all, elbows on knees, head bowed, though the scion thought he spied Jajasamu giving her an appraising look. Before they had set out, Arenval had been with her when the thaumaturge wandered over. She had been kneeling in the sand, packing up her gear when he asked why she had risked her life to save his. Little girls need their fathers, was all she said, before tightening a final strap and boarding the carriage. The man had turned to him then, his face a picture of perplexity. I never said anything about having a daughter, to which Arenval could only shrug and smile. Lucky guess. It all begins with the first step. The winter of the Garlean Empire's 33rd year was a bitterly cold one, and the capital lay muffled under a thick blanket of snow. Black uniform stark against the pristine white, a boy strode as briskly as he could through the knee-high drifts, his boots spraying powdery flakes before him with every hurried step. And I'm the first to arrive, the boy huffed in satisfaction as he stood before the main entrance to the Magitech Academy's central library, having sprang up the stately stone steps 2 at a time. Brushing his silvery hair out of his eyes, however, his moment of triumph was cut short by the sight of a skinny youth, blond and smirking, sidling into view from behind a colossal marble pillar. Sorry to disappoint you, Garland, but you'll have to get up earlier than that to beat me. Such was the first meeting between Sid Garland and Nero Sceva, at least as far as the young Sid was aware. The pair were similarly exceptional. As the son of Midas non Garland, the Empire's foremost authority on Magitech, and a renowned child prodigy in his own right, Sid had been invited to apply to the Magitech Academy some few moons before. Nero, too, had earned fame as the genius of his province, and would have been comfortably the youngest student in the institution were it not for the presence of the equally precocious Sid. Though both boys were barely into their 12 summers, their extraordinary achievements had qualified them to sit the entrance examinations 4 years earlier than was normally permitted. Accustomed to always being top of the class back home, Nero was not amused to find that the only other boy his age was held in higher esteem. His theretofore unsurpassed brilliance had secured him a patron and passage to the capital, and when he finally laid eyes upon his silver-haired rival during the Academy's entrance ceremony, he had vowed to outdo him in every conceivable manner. "Do I know you?" Sid snapped in irritation. Gifted though he was no less a 12-year-old boy. And this brash youth who had addressed him with such scorn had immediately raised his hackles. "You should. But I don't suppose you've any time for peasants from the provinces, Nero shot back. The name's Sceva, Nero Sceva. I'm the one who's going to upstage you at the exhibition by taking home first prize. The Imperial Youth Magitech exhibition was a showcase for aspiring engineers from across the Empire to submit their Magitech creations for expert appraisal. Sid had entered an invention a year before joining the Academy, going on to become the youngest ever participant to win the event's highest honor, and it was to research his submission for this year's contest that he had endeavored to arrive at the library just as it was due to open its doors for the day. Sid knew that many of the older students regarded him as the person to beat, but none had gone so far as to declare their rivalry directly to his face. As such, Nero's cocksure challenge flustered him more than he cared to admit. From that day onwards, Nero made a habit of antagonizing Sid at every opportunity. If Sid should borrow a research volume, he would declare its content elementary. If Sid was using the workshop's lath to make a part, its quality would be substandard. Even the selections Sid made at the lunch hall did not escape judgment, invariably befitting the palate of an infant. Damn you, Nero, Sid fumed to himself as he worked to assemble the delicate pieces of his submission. Will you never leave me be? And so the months passed. Spring came at length, though the weather refused to acknowledge it, the snow showing no signs of melting as the capital shivered in winter's lingering chill. Yet despite the cold outside, the exhibition hall was stifling, the air heated by the frenzied activity of the many students within. Wearing variously panicked expressions, they bustled around their respective pieces, desperate to ensure a smooth performance for the contest's final and most heavily weighted category, the practical demonstration. Sid himself was busy testing each component of the flying machine he had constructed, focusing intently upon the flapping motion of his invention's ether-infused wings. You don't honestly think a flimsy toy like that will impress the judges? A voice dripping with disdain prodded at Sid's consciousness, shattering his concentration. Not now, Sceva. My hypercurrent cannon will garner 10 times, nay 100 times the interest. Nero had arrived, cradling a sleek tube in his arms, which he now proudly presented for Sid's inspection. Though his soul cried out to tell him where to shove it, Sid's better self reasoned that he would gain nothing from rising to this obvious provocation, and he continued working on his own device in determined silence. An instant later, a deafening roar reverberated around the auditorium. What in the... An explosion, offered his inner voice. Suppressing a smile, Sid stood up to see whose invention had met with misfortune. But rather than twisted pieces of Magitech, his questing gaze picked out a group of soldiers emerging from a haze of drifting white smoke. They belonged to no legion. The mismatched equipment, the unshaven faces, the unkempt hair. It all pointed to one thing: rebels. The initial moment of shock was broken by a single piercing scream, and then the hall dissolved into chaos. Students clambered over each other in their haste to flee, abandoning their precious works without so much as a backwards glance. "This is an outrage," stammered Nero, the sight of armed dissidents sending cracks through his usual veneer of self-assurance. How did this rabble slip into the capital? Sid appeared stunned by the scene unfolding before him, but though his body was slow to respond, his mind was already assembling the puzzle of the who, the what, and the why. As he watched, the apparent leader of the insurgent group quickly scanned the faces in the exhibition hall, then turned to bark orders at his fellows. "The target's not here. You lot keep the Imperials at bay. The rest of you, upstairs with me." A handful of rebels then began erecting barricades and ejecting clumps of cowering students, while their comrades headed toward a nearby staircase. "They're looking for someone." The moment Sid whispered the words out loud, he knew. Of all the dignitaries currently in attendance, the most notable was, without a doubt, the judging panel's chairman, the Empire's preeminent engineer, Medus non-Garland. Father. Though Sid had yet to ascertain the motive, it was enough to know his sire's life was in danger. He clutched his flying machine close to his chest and ran. Avoiding the throng of panicked students scrambling towards the building's exits, he made for a staircase and raced up to the second floor. If he remembered correctly, a conference room had been set aside for the judges to take their ease during the exhibition's lengthy preparation periods. Slowing from his mad dash, Sid crept along the last few yalms of a side corridor. From around the corner, he heard a man snarl, "Call off the test or you die. I won't ask again." All the pieces fell into place. His father had scarce been at home this past moon, his time spent traveling back and forth between the capital and Bajja's citadel in the frontier lands, where some important and confidential experiment was taking place at the behest of the Emperor himself. And the garb of these rebels seemed to match the descriptions he had read of the province's people. Their plan was obvious now. By taking his sire prisoner, they hoped to put a stop to whatever it was he was working on, imagining his experiment a threat to their home. The military would be reluctant to endanger the father of Magitech, and thus they need not fear any heavily armed reprisals, in the short term at least. After Daddy, are they? Sid jolted in surprise, almost dropping his flying machine. Spinning his head, he saw a blond boy crouch behind him, also hugging his invention. "Keep your bloody voice down, Nero," Sid hissed. "Why in the seven hells did you follow me?" "I couldn't let you run off and get killed," Nero explained with forced nonchalance. "You wouldn't be there to see me win the contest." "The contest," Sid spat, barely stifling a shout. "Is that all you can think about?" "Only until I've won it," came the reply, "and while I'm certain my cannon will take first prize, it will be a hollow victory without your submission sitting there below it on the podium." Incensed, Sid closed his eyes and took a deep breath. But in that moment, an idea came to him. His eyes snapped open and flicked between the Magitech devices they both still held in vice-like grips. "If you're so keen to have our entries judged," he whispered, fixing Nero with a stare, "help me save the judges." Thus began an unprecedented collaboration between the two young prodigies. Concealing themselves within a sanitation closet, they proceeded to strip down the hypercurrent cannon and attach it to the flying machine, all without a word of disagreement passing their lips. The result was a rudimentary combat drone. "We've created an airborne Magitech turret," Nero crowed in delight. Ignoring his companion's enthusiasm, Sid fiddled with his half of the control module they had pieced together from the leftover parts. The compact cerulean engine snorted comically as it whirred to life, but despite the additional weight, the newly built turret lifted smoothly off the floor, its ether wings beating slow and steady. "Right," Sid looked up, satisfied that the device was operational. "I'll do the flying, you do the firing." "As you command, Master Garland." Nero threw wide the closet door, and Sid sent the drone hurtling down the hallway at maximum speed. Once around the corner, a crackling burst from the cannon struck the rebel standing guard. His limbs twitched spasmodically as he fell senseless to the floor. Without slowing, the buzzing machine barreled on into the conference room, its breathless operators a few steps behind. "It's the army!" The Bajans scrambled to bring their weapons to bear, their leader stepping forward to answer the sudden intrusion. "Stop right there," he demanded. "We have a And there his words devolved into an agonized scream as a bolt of energy struck him squarely in the chest. "Enjoy the demonstration." Nero jabbed at the firing button with fiendish glee, and arcs of crackling lightning filled the room. A short while later, the Imperial Guard arrived at the auditorium. The Emperor's finest duly cut through the defenders downstairs and stormed the upper floor, only to be greeted by the sight of a heap of unconscious insurgents and a glassy-eyed Midas non Garland, all victims of Nero's indiscriminate display. Once every trace of the incident had been swept away and the affected parties afforded sufficient time to recover, the interrupted exhibition held its award ceremony. The identity of the winner came as no surprise to anyone, or rather the winners. First prize was awarded to Sid Garland and Nero Scava in honor of their jointly created Magitech turret. "Something troubling you, Chief?" Sid's head snapped up at Jesse's query, leaving his hand with no beard to stroke. "Oh, no, I was just thinking about the old days." Jesse raised an eyebrow. "Anything to do with that data you requested?" It was true that ever since he had asked for a certain research file to be smuggled out of the Empire, Sid had perhaps indulged in more brooding than was healthy. He had work to do, he knew, and the stakes could hardly be higher. "Worried about me?" he teased, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Jesse. I've made peace with the past. Besides," he continued, the grin genuine now, "the memories aren't all bad." The time for deliberation was over. Nodding to his colleagues, Sid Garland, master engineer, strode off to join his companions in their fated and final confrontation. So that's it. How'd you guys like this story? If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and if you really want to show your support, you can donate to the channel through the link in the description. Until next time, guys. Later.